The physical environment of the Senate Budget Committee room was structurally engineered for procedural monotony. The overhead fluorescent lighting was stark and clinical, illuminating the sweating condensation on the water glasses and the rigid, synchronized movements of the legislative aides seated behind the lawmakers. The formal title of the session was Federal Fraud Prevention and Oversight, Strengthening Accountability in Taxpayer-Funded Programs. It was a bureaucratic designation historically designed to ensure maximum public disinterest. Representative Ilhan Omar occupied a seat on the same side of the elevated wooden dais as Senator John Kennedy. The physical proximity dictated that this was not a remote, insulated television exchange. It was a direct institutional confrontation. As the hearing commenced, Representative Omar operated under a fatal procedural assumption. She fundamentally confused the active microphone with a defensive perimeter. She evaluated Senator Kennedy's deliberate Louisiana drawl, his relaxed physical posture, and his polite regional smile, and systematically miscalculated his operational readiness. She categorized his demeanor as performative rather than preparatory. That assessment was the primary structural error of the morning. Senator Kennedy's specific regional persona was never the actual weapon. It was strictly the operational camouflage surrounding the weapon. The polite cadence functioned as a velvet cloth draped meticulously over a forensic scalpel. Behind the slow articulation was an individual who processed numerical data with the same automatic fluency that other political figures applied to scripted applause lines. Representative Omar was scheduled to provide standard testimony regarding fraud prevention within federal nutrition programs. For the initial 60 seconds, she maintained strict adherence to the prepared statement generated by her staff. However, she abruptly altered her operational trajectory. She abandoned the oversight parameters and pivoted toward a highly personalized theatrical offensive. She actively accused Senator Kennedy of prioritizing viral internet traps over genuine legislative accountability. She then deployed a localized attack utilizing the specific socioeconomic metrics of Louisiana poverty rates, healthcare deficits, and educational statistics as a rhetorical mechanism to undermine his authority. The atmospheric pressure within the chamber immediately shifted. The unwritten rules of the committee room dictated a specific reality that Representative Omar had failed to recognize. By utilizing arithmetic and statistical data to execute a personal insult, she had formally granted a forensic auditor the absolute permission to discuss arithmetic. Senator Kennedy did not elevate his vocal register. He did not slap the mahogany table. He performed absolutely no outrage. He remained seated with his pen hovering statically over a yellow legal pad, his reading glasses positioned low on his nose. The chairman formally inquired if the senator wished to issue a response to the critique. Kennedy engaged his microphone with the terrifying patience of an individual who had already predetermined the exact sequence of the upcoming audit. He initiated his response by politely thanking her for the critique regarding Louisiana's mathematical capabilities. He stated, with absolute vocal neutrality, that he found the insult amusing and might utilize it in the future. A brief wave of nervous, mechanical laughter rippled through the gallery, functioning less as amusement and more as an acoustic warning bell. Then, the senator executed the pivotal maneuver. He stated that since the Budget Committee was structurally designed to analyze numbers, he intended to initiate a detailed review of her specific numbers. At that exact second, the manila folder was introduced into the physical space. In the context of a federal hearing room, a physical folder is never merely compressed paper. It is a quiet, visual declaration that the foundational homework has already been finalized. It confirms that the upcoming inquiries are not speculative fishing expeditions, but the systematic arrangement of pre-verified evidence in a public forum. Kennedy placed the folder onto the desk. The movement was slow, deliberate, and entirely devoid of theatricality. He established the baseline metric for the room. He explained that following her commentary on his state's arithmetic, he had directed the committee staff to execute a line-by-line comparison of two specific legal documents. They cross-referenced her original 2024 financial disclosure, formally filed in May 2025, directly against her amended disclosure, filed in March 2026. He clarified the parameters of the audit. They did not review the generalized totals or the vague summary ranges. They analyzed every single entry, every listed asset, and every numerical value anchored directly to her legal signature. The senator then delivered the initial findings. The committee staff had officially identified 17 distinct discrepancies between the two signed documents. That specific integer hit the acoustic space of the room with the density of a concrete block. It did not sound like a political slogan. It sounded exactly like a forensic audit. A single discrepancy can be categorized as a clerical error. Two discrepancies might indicate administrative sloppiness, but 17 separate line item deviations do not constitute a typographical error wandering aimlessly across a federal form. 17 is an operational pattern, and the audit had only just begun. The numerical baseline was now officially established within the hearing room, 17 distinct discrepancies. In the highly regulated ecosystem of federal oversight, a financial disclosure form is not a casual administrative survey. It is a legally binding document. One isolated discrepancy can be procedurally categorized as a clerical mistake. Two discrepancies might indicate standard administrative sloppiness, but 17 legally binding contradictions do not constitute a typographical error wandering aimlessly across a federal form. 17 is a deliberate operational pattern. Senator Kennedy did not elevate his volume to emphasize the number because the raw arithmetic was already executing the structural damage. At the witness table, Representative Omar's hand instinctively moved toward the stacked papers positioned in front of her. She began physically flipping and searching through the pages. It was the natural, mechanical motion of a politician desperately searching for a pre-written defensive talking point after walking blindly into an unprepared disaster. However, congressional staff cannot draft a clean, coherent defense for 17 separate line items that fundamentally refuse to behave. Senator Kennedy initiated the surgical review with Rose Lake Capital, LLC, a venture capital firm associated with her husband. He read through the original disclosure valuation, the amended disclosure, and the established public record with the absolute calm of a meteorologist reading a weather report for a devastating storm that everyone else had actively ignored. The structural contradictions were massive. The original federal disclosure valued the venture capital firm at somewhere between $1 million and $25 million. The amended disclosure, filed at a later date, dropped that exact valuation entirely to zero. It was a financial correction so violently extreme that it abandoned the appearance of accuracy and adopted the distinct visual profile of administrative panic. Looking over his reading glasses, Kennedy introduced a third document into the record, an email from the public domain valuing Rose Lake at exactly $7.9 million in the year 2025. The mathematical reality was inescapable. The original submitted number was vastly too high. The amended submitted number was vastly too low. And the objective truth was sitting somewhere in the middle, actively watching both federal filings embarrass themselves. That was not a correction, Kennedy stated, his vocal delivery devoid of any theatrical outrage. That was a cover-up that overshot. It was a tactical assessment that landed perfectly in the silent room, primarily because it did not sound like an invented political attack. It sounded like an inevitable forensic conclusion. The audit immediately pivoted to the E Street Group. This was the consulting income line that sat on both the original and the amended disclosures, like a locked vault door that nobody in the representative's office wanted opened. Kennedy formally identified $287,000 in active consulting income explicitly attributed to this specific entity. He then introduced the corporate timeline. According to official registries, the business had formally shut down and ceased operations in 2021. It was a defunct corporate shell. Yet, according to the signed disclosures, this supposedly non-functional entity was somehow still producing hundreds of thousands of dollars in active income 3 full years later. Representative Omar attempted a standard procedural maneuver, attempting to push the legal and administrative responsibility toward her husband's accounting practices. Kennedy deployed the forensic scalpel, cutting straight through the escape hatch before its hinges could even operate. The legal reality of federal disclosures is absolute. Her printed name was on the header of the document. Her physical signature was on the final page of the filing. Most critically, the form was submitted strictly under the penalty of perjury. That specific legal parameter made the document her exclusive, inescapable obligation, regardless of whether the capital originated from her husband, his company, or a corporate ghost holding a consulting contract. The core inquiry remains suspended in the sterile air, ugly and incredibly simple. How exactly does a legally closed company generate $287,000? Kennedy did not need to utilize the word corrupt in every sentence. The numbers were already standing there in the middle of the room with their hands raised, actively begging to testify. He systematically moved to the speaking fees. The original disclosure listed $45,000. The amended disclosure listed $12,000. The resulting arithmetic left a $33,000 gap. It was a massive financial void that could not be massaged into harmless administrative confusion without directly insulting the intelligence of every single individual sitting in the committee chamber. According to the internal logic of her own filings, paying audiences had either transferred the capital and physically vanished, or they had never existed in the first place, or they existed in a highly convenient administrative fog where money magically appears while accountability entirely disappears. Kennedy simply let that missing $33,000 sit there, occupying the physical space like an empty chair at the witness table. By this exact moment in the hearing, Representative Omar's opening insult regarding Louisiana's mathematical capability had aged terribly, and every person in the room knew it. The politician who had confidently mocked Kennedy's inquiries as little viral traps was now thoroughly trapped inside questions so structurally basic they barely qualified as traps. A trap implies a degree of hidden cleverness. These were not traps. These were just massive financial doors she had carelessly left wide open. Senator Kennedy proceeded to advance the physical contents of the manila folder. He formally closed the section detailing the defunct consulting firm executing the transition with the clinical precision of a surgeon finalizing one incision before immediately initiating the next. He turned the documentation to a specific corporate entity, a commercial winery. The entity was officially registered as EST Crew Wines, co-founded in California in the year 2021 by Representative Omar's husband, Tim Minnitt. According to the original 2024 federal financial disclosure, this specific business stake was formally valued at somewhere between $1 million and $5 million. In the operational context of Washington politics, a multi-million-dollar California winery functions as a highly respectable asset. It provides a glossy, premium narrative that effectively reassures high-tier campaign donors. Furthermore, the broad multi-million-dollar valuation ranges permitted on federal disclosure forms intentionally provide politicians with massive administrative space to hide behind financial fog. Senator Kennedy, however, possessed zero forensic interest in the external branding of the asset. He was exclusively focused on the empirical contents of the corporate architecture. He extracted a new document from the folder, a sworn investor affidavit explicitly attached to an active fraud lawsuit. The introduction of a sworn affidavit fundamentally altered the acoustic pressure of the hearing room. Sworn statements submitted to a federal court operate under the absolute penalty of perjury. They are structurally immune to political public relations. Kennedy began to read the formal allegations into the congressional record. The defrauded investors submitted sworn testimony stating that Minute had provided photographic evidence of a sprawling, active vineyard located in Sonoma County. The investor was explicitly told that this specific geographic location served as the primary operational production facility for EST Crew wines. It was precisely the kind of curated visual narrative designed to make a $300,000 capital check feel less like a high-risk gamble and more like a guaranteed physical investment in California, real estate, agricultural equipment, and future commercial growth. Then, the senator read the foundational reality of the corporate structure. The company did not own that specific vineyard. They did not possess a legal lease for the property. They did not functionally operate the facility. It was not their agricultural land, it did not contain their grapes, and it was completely disconnected from their commercial operation. According to the sworn affidavit, the entity had simply utilized photographic documentation of someone else's physical property to sell a fabricated financial story. Kennedy allowed that specific image to hang suspended in the sterile air of the committee room. He did not utilize it as a political metaphor. He deployed it as empirical evidence. The glossy narrative of the multi-million-dollar California winery instantly collapsed into the reality of a fabricated label wrapped tightly around an entirely empty bottle. The forensic audit immediately transitioned to the corporate balance sheet. Kennedy pointed directly to the established court record detailing the company's financial status at the exact time the lawsuit was formally initiated. The entity possessed exactly $650 in its active bank account. The senator allowed the mathematical contradiction to materialize for the committee. A corporate entity legally valued on a federal disclosure at up to $5 million, possessing exactly $650 in liquid capital, is not a business success story. It is a massive structural math problem wearing a cork. Kennedy's sarcasm remained tightly controlled, mirroring the precise danger of a blade that does not need to be waved to inflict damage. He stated, with slow, deliberate articulation, that even the local muscadine growers in Louisiana understand a fundamental agricultural equation. A commercial vineyard possessing exactly 0 grapes holds a maximum market value of $0, not $5 million, not $1 million, precisely 0. A few isolated instances of nervous laughter escaped from the public gallery. The sound did not indicate genuine amusement. It was the biological release of extreme psychological pressure from individuals watching the structural walls of a political career begin to physically crack. Representative Omar did not laugh. Her legislative staff did not laugh. The manila folder resting on the desk had completely ceased to be a theatrical prop. It had functionally become an exact topographical map of every single location she desperately did not want the hearing to travel. Kennedy was not finished. He introduced the official records from the California Secretary of State, and the administrative timeline became exponentially uglier. EST Crew Wines had formally filed official articles of termination on April 4, 2026. That specific legal termination occurred exactly 9 days after Representative Omar had abruptly amended her federal disclosure to drop the asset's valuation to 0. The administrative correction did not exist in an isolated vacuum. It was executed in direct, synchronized panic alongside the formal legal collapse of the corporate entity itself. Furthermore, Kennedy entered into the record that the company had filed absolutely 0 annual revenue reports for the fiscal years of 2023 or 2024. Revenue reports are not optional corporate decorations. They are the mandatory, foundational paperwork that legitimate operational businesses leave behind as empirical proof of their existence. The senator delivered the clinical summary of the asset: no physical vineyard, no filed revenue reports, a corporate bank account holding exactly $650, an active fraud lawsuit involving photographs of a stranger's property. Yet, somehow, this specific entity had been categorized as a multi-million-dollar financial asset on a federal disclosure form explicitly signed under the penalty of perjury. It was a devastating forensic sequence. It did not require the audience to generate emotional hatred toward the representative. It simply required them to observe the catastrophic failure of the mathematics sitting directly on the page. A seasoned politician can effectively spin ideology, dodge policy inquiries, and bury the electorate under a relentless avalanche of campaign slogans. But when the bank account holds $650 and the federal disclosure claims $5 million, the defense requires significantly more than an angry public statement. A legislative aide seated behind Representative Omar slowly slid a sequence of printed notes toward her. Her eyes, however, remained entirely locked onto Kennedy's manila folder. The written notes were short. The folder was incredibly long. And Senator Kennedy was preparing to turn the page again. Senator Kennedy physically advanced the audit by executing a deliberate, visible maneuver. He turned several pages of the manila folder simultaneously, intentionally skipping over a significant volume of printed material. Within the highly calibrated psychology of a congressional hearing, this specific mechanical action generated a psychological effect significantly more severe than reading the pages aloud. The deliberate omission of material operated as a quiet, structural threat. It visually communicated to the entire committee that the previous financial contradictions did not represent the bottom of the investigative file. They merely represented the specific section he had actively chosen to deploy under the public lighting. He arrived at a section marked with a solid red tab. The ambient temperature of the hearing room appeared to undergo a physical drop. The operational focus of the interrogation abruptly shifted. The preceding inquiries regarding fluctuating venture capital valuations and defunct consulting entities represented highly embarrassing personal financial irregularities. The contents beneath the red tab represented the systematic theft of public capital explicitly allocated for hungry children during a global pandemic. Kennedy introduced the formal nomenclature of the scandal into the official record, Feeding Our Future. This specific operation was not categorized as a localized bookkeeping anomaly. It was not an administrative headache, and it was absolutely not an innocent technical misunderstanding regarding the acceptable ranges on federal disclosure forms. It was formally defined as a $250 million fraud scheme, officially classified as the largest COVID-era fraud prosecution of its specific kind. Kennedy detailed the mechanical architecture of the criminal enterprise with absolute clinical detachment. The operation was entirely constructed around fictitious meal distribution sites and the massive diversion of federal nutrition subsidies. The identities of non-existent children were systematically utilized as administrative paperwork, functioning exclusively as a mechanism for adult operators to extract federal capital. That extracted capital was subsequently diverted to procure luxury vehicles, high-end jewelry, commercial real estate portfolios, and international wire transfers. The senator deliberately established the massive scale of the criminal enterprise before he introduced a specific political connection, a sequencing tactic designed to ensure the context maximized the kinetic impact. 75 federal defendants, entirely fabricated distribution sites, federal relief funds that were congressionally authorized to feed vulnerable populations, systematically converted into a high-velocity private enrichment machine. Then Kennedy established the direct documented link. He stated, reading directly from the prepared documentation, that Representative Omar's specific name had officially appeared exactly 6 times within the active trial exhibits originating from the prosecution of Amy Boach. In the tightly controlled environment of a federal hearing, the integer 6 does not function as political gossip. It is not an unverified rumor circulating on a digital blog. It is not a viral social media meme. And it is not a truncated, out-of-context sentence utilized in a hostile campaign advertisement. It is a verified numerical count derived directly from federal evidentiary exhibits. Senator Kennedy ensured the committee recognized that specific counts hold absolute institutional weight. Representative Omar immediately attempted to deploy a standard legal defense mechanism. She stated for the record that she had never been formally charged with any criminal offense related to the fraud ring. The statement was factually accurate within the narrow parameters of her defense framework. However, Senator Kennedy immediately dismantled the sentence, refusing to allow the legal distinction to serve as a functional political hiding place. He clarified his inquiry. He noted that he had not asked whether she had been formally indicted by the Department of Justice. He had specifically inquired about her documented presence within the communication exhibits. Kennedy then executed a brutal forensic dissection of legal terminology. He explained to the committee that politicians routinely attempt to conflate the phrase "not charged" with the concept of being cleared when the two operational states are fundamentally and legally different. The designation of "not charged" merely indicates that the federal government has not yet formulated a prosecutorial case. The designation of "cleared" indicates that the underlying facts have been exhaustively examined, the data has been verified, and the ethical cloud has been permanently and officially lifted. Kennedy's assessment was devastating strictly because of its clinical precision. Representative Omar had not been federally charged, but she had absolutely not been cleared. And regarding the core mechanisms of the operation, what she had been was completely silent. Senator Kennedy executed the next phase of the audit by introducing a secondary visual artifact into the congressional record, a physical timeline chart. If the initial manila folder functioned as a quiet, structural threat, the timeline chart operated as an explicit visual indictment. The visual architecture of the chart was constructed with absolute, unforgiving simplicity. It consisted of 3 parallel columns. The first column tracked direct communications involving the documented fraud ring and Representative Omar's congressional office. The second column tracked specific legislative maneuvers designed to affect oversight parameters for the United States Department of Agriculture meal programs. The third column tracked the largest fraudulent financial disbursements executing from the Feeding Our Future network. Kennedy began to descend the chart, operating with the grim patience of an investigator, reading off street names while navigating toward a documented crime scene. He established the chronological baseline, February 2021. An official email was transmitted from Amy Bach directly to Representative Omar's office, specifically requesting assistance with USDA food programs. March 2021, Representative Omar formally co-sponsored a legislative amendment explicitly designed to expand emergency USDA waivers for meal program providers. This action functioned to systematically loosen the federal oversight requirements. April 2021, the Feeding Our Future network successfully disbursed exactly $47 million through 38 separate operational sites. Investigators later determined with empirical certainty that every single one of those 38 sites was completely fictitious. The senator paused, allowing the acoustic weight of the sequence to settle over the committee. The timeline did not constitute absolute prosecutorial proof of every implication Kennedy presented. However, the sequential timing was drastically too neat, mathematically too heavy, and structurally too ugly for the defense to simply shrug away. When the federal government systematically loosens its oversight parameters and tens of millions of dollars immediately flood into fabricated locations, the American public does not require a complex lecture regarding legislative procedure. It requires a forensic answer. Kennedy resumed his navigation of the chart, June 2021. Another digital email chain was intercepted carrying the specific subject line, Ilhan's office. July 2021. A formal legislative letter was drafted expressing explicit support for the continued application of emergency waivers for Minnesota meal programs. August 2021. Another $62 million in federal capital was aggressively dispersed by the Feeding Our Future network. November 2021. The Meals Act was formally introduced, further loosening the federal oversight and operational requirements. December 2021. Fraudulent financial disbursements reached an absolute apex, peaking at exactly $83 million in a single fiscal quarter. Every single time the chronological timeline advanced, the exact same mechanical pattern seemed to follow in rigid synchronization. Direct contact was initiated, federal oversight was loosened, and massive volumes of taxpayer money flowed out. Senator Kennedy did not need to utilize theatrical terminology or categorize the chart as a smoking gun. He had constructed something significantly more uncomfortable for the witness, an impenetrable wall of dates that mathematically forced everyone sitting in the hearing room to independently execute the arithmetic. Kennedy then translated the abstract concept of a fictitious meal site into plain, devastating English. He described a physical storefront, a local community center, or a restaurant, a specific address printed on federal paperwork, claiming to have served thousands of meals to hungry children when the operational reality was absolute zero. Nobody procured the food, nobody cooked the meals, nobody handed them out to the community, and critically, nobody from the government verified their existence, entirely because the emergency oversight protocols had been officially waived. This was the cruel, beating heart of the scandal. The capital theft did not occur within an abstract, sanitized federal ledger buried deep in Washington. It was executed by actively weaponizing the image of starving children during the COVID pandemic. Money moved exclusively because the loosened federal forms dictated that the meals existed, while the empirical reality confirmed the meals did not exist. Representative Omar attempted a defensive countermeasure, stating for the record that her actions were strictly limited to helping her constituents access legitimate federal programs. It was the precise category of sentence that sounds fundamentally responsible until Senator Kennedy deliberately held it up against the active indictments, the intercepted emails, and the fleeing defendants. Kennedy's response was acoustic precision. He noted that Abdihakim Idlah did not flee the jurisdiction of the United States because he was passionately helping constituents access legitimate programs. He fled the country because he was federally accused of operating within a massive fraud ring, explicitly stealing capital from vulnerable children. The room did not require dramatic background music. The raw contrast was brutal enough on its own. Representative Omar's physical posture visibly altered, her body turning slightly toward her staff, directing her visual focus anywhere that was not Kennedy's documentation. To seal the sequence, Kennedy added one final documented artifact into the public record. While the $250 million fraud was actively exploding, Representative Omar had physically appeared in a Somali language promotional video actively praising one of the specific restaurants utilized in the criminal program. That singular visual artifact took her defense perimeter from structurally weak to nearly impossible. The camera had permanently placed her in immediate physical proximity to the exact operation she was now desperately attempting to keep at arm's length. Senator Kennedy did not permit the committee to linger on the staggering implications of the Feeding Our Future network. He deliberately prevented Representative Omar from generating a defensive, rhetorical fog around the subject because the manila folder contained yet another distinct section awaiting public examination. This specific section was authenticated by an official state seal. Exactly 5 days prior to this congressional hearing, the Minnesota Campaign Finance Board had formally issued a legal order specifically targeting Representative Omar's campaign committee. Kennedy physically opened the document. He directed the room's attention first to the specific page that the general public and standard press syndicates would naturally consume, and subsequently to the page they would almost certainly ignore. He began with page 7. This page contained the primary administrative headline. The state board had officially found violations, imposed a civil penalty, and legally ordered the immediate reimbursement of campaign funds that had been illicitly diverted for private personal expenses. The senator read the itemized nature of those personal expenses directly into the record. The diverted donor capital had been utilized to procure private immigration services and to process joint personal tax returns. In the rigid architecture of political oversight, this specific detail possesses a deeply ugly mechanical reality. Capital donated to a political committee is legally restricted. It is explicitly engineered to serve the structural operations of a campaign, not to function as a slush fund to clean up private administrative paperwork. When working-class voters write financial checks to a political candidate, they are fundamentally participating in the democratic process. They are absolutely not volunteering to secretly subsidize a sitting politician's private tax filing. Kennedy stated this baseline reality with absolute clinical clarity, requiring zero theatrical fireworks. Citizens transferred their personal capital to finance her congressional run, and the official state board confirmed that the capital was subsequently hijacked to conduct her personal, private business. However, Senator Kennedy possessed no forensic interest in stopping the inquiry where the Standard Press headlines stopped. In the discipline of financial auditing, headlines are simply where lazy, generalized outrage goes to die. He instructed the committee to turn to page 13 of the order. This was the page he noted most reporters had likely skipped. And resting quietly on this specific page was a significantly harder, exponentially more dangerous question. It was the precise category of inquiry that completely defies neat 3-second television clips, but structurally matters far more. The state board had formally identified 14 additional financial expenditures. The cumulative value of these transfers totaled exactly $41,200. The sole administrative justification listed for this massive outflow of capital was the phrase community outreach. Kennedy deployed the forensic microscope. He detailed the absolute administrative void surrounding these specific transfers. There was zero supporting documentation. There was no specific description of the services rendered. There were no fiscal receipts. There were no identified beneficiaries. There were no documented public events. There was absolutely no empirical proof that the phrase community outreach meant anything beyond serving as a highly polite administrative bucket where tens of thousands of dollars could seamlessly disappear. Kennedy understood the exact operational danger of those specific words. In the rigorous domain of financial oversight, vague accounting labels do not function as harmless administrative decorations. They function as deliberate, opaque curtains. He stated for the official record that the 3 most dangerous words in the entire lexicon of financial fraud are miscellaneous, consulting, and outreach. Each specific term shares a common deceptive architecture. They sound deeply respectable while successfully revealing absolutely nothing. The line landed with devastating weight because every individual in the chamber who had ever analyzed a fraudulent corporate expense report recognized the exact mechanical truth of his statement. The concept of community outreach can certainly represent a legitimate physical event involving real citizens executing real service and generating real public benefit. But when that specific phrase appears exactly 14 consecutive times, entirely devoid of supporting receipts, its operational nature shifts. It ceases to look like public service and begins to function exclusively as an accounting password. $41,200 does not constitute a marginal rounding error for a localized campaign committee, and it is mathematically impossible to categorize it as nothing when it is structurally paired with private tax reimbursements, 17 distinct disclosure contradictions, and massive volumes of unexplained income originating from a defunct corporate shell. Representative Omar remained seated in total silence while Senator Kennedy executed the public addition. The addition itself was the ultimate weapon. Isolated, each individual accounting anomaly might have been aggressively argued down, rhetorically blurred, politically softened, or simply blamed on the incompetence of a subordinate accountant. However, fused together within the manila folder, they structurally materialized into a definitive pattern. And empirical patterns are the precise phenomenon that politicians fear most when the individual describing them possesses the capacity to count. Senator Kennedy was executing the exact function the committee was originally designed to perform. He was mathematically adding the data in public. The arithmetic was already dragging the entire narrative forward, completely independent of partisan ideology. Senator Kennedy executed a profound structural shift within the hearing. He physically set aside the manila folder that had dominated the proceedings, slowly removed his reading glasses, and explicitly established that the subsequent inquiry would no longer focus on financial metrics. The acoustic pressure in the room registered the shift before he even completed his sentence. His vocal register transitioned directly from the cold cadence of an auditor to the raw frequency of public grief and basic conscience. He introduced the name Charlie Kirk into the congressional record. He did not utilize political categorizations. He described him strictly as a 31-year-old husband and the father of 2 young children. He detailed the mechanical reality of his death. He was assassinated at Utah Valley University, shot directly through the neck while delivering a public address. While the previous financial inquiries had rendered the committee room highly tense, this specific subject rendered it absolutely still. Kennedy presented the timeline of Representative Omar's documented reaction to the assassination. He noted that exactly 1 day following the murder, she appeared on a television broadcast and heavily implied that the victim bore direct responsibility for his own execution. Exactly 48 hours following the killing, she utilized her digital platform to amplify a video categorizing the murdered father as a stochastic terrorist, utilizing specific language that actively mocked the violent nature of his death. Kennedy articulated these phrases with extreme care. He did not do so for theatrical effect. He did so because the specific terminology had to be permanently anchored into the federal record, where no future press statement could effectively rinse it clean. He clarified the fundamental parameter of the discussion. The central issue was not that Representative Omar harbored deep political disagreements with the victim, as Washington is entirely constructed upon lucrative, systemic disagreement. The core issue was that a sitting member of the United States Congress had actively amplified a narrative framing a murdered young father as the author of his own assassination, doing so while his immediate family was actively absorbing an unthinkable trauma. Kennedy categorized this behavior not as standard political combat, but as moral rot operating under a congressional title. The senator then revealed the depth of his preparatory work. Prior to the hearing, he had directly contacted the attorney representing the victim's widow, Erica Kirk. He did not initiate the contact to engineer a political stunt or secure a public statement. He contacted the legal representative to ask one highly specific question. Had Representative Omar ever reached out to the grieving family? A telephone call, an email, a text message, or a standard condolence card, any microscopic gesture to indicate that beneath the political hostility, there remained a baseline human recognition that a widow had lost her husband and 2 children had lost their father. The confirmed answer was absolutely no. 8 full months had elapsed since the assassination. In that time, she had found the operational speed to publicly repost condemnation while maintaining absolute silence to avoid basic condolence. Kennedy did not need to elevate his volume because the mathematical contrast he subsequently delivered was already savage. 48 hours to rapidly share a video mocking the deceased, and 243 days without locating 5 minutes to draft a private condolence card. This specific phase of the confrontation bypassed all standard defense mechanisms. Financial irregularities can theoretically be answered with amended documents, delayed receipts, or carefully sculpted legal justifications. But the deliberate absence of a condolence is a fundamentally different category of void. Kennedy forced the committee chamber to visualize a specific future, the victims' children growing older, typing their father's name into a digital search engine, and discovering the exact words a sitting member of Congress had chosen to broadcast about his assassination. He did not bury that image under emotional poetry. He simply let it stand in plain, cruel English. Representative Omar sat completely immobile. At this specific moment, her physical stillness ceased to resemble a strategic political posture. Kennedy then executed a masterful closure, drawing the narrative directly back to her initial insult. He openly acknowledged the statistical problems present within his home state of Louisiana. He did not attempt to dodge the poverty metrics or the health care deficits she had weaponized against him earlier in the morning. However, he established the definitive moral distinction. The citizens of Louisiana, he noted, do not publicly celebrate when a young man is shot through the neck. They do not publicly blame a dead father for his own murder, and they absolutely do not mock a violent assassination while a widow is actively planning a funeral. There was no country lawyer punchline deployed. There was no polite escape valve. It was Kennedy establishing with absolute finality that Representative Omar had fundamentally confused political combat with the permission to abandon basic human decency. Senator Kennedy executed the final procedural maneuver of the hearing by physically returning to the manila folder. The committee chamber could acutely feel the closing argument materializing. He began to list the accumulated numerical data once again. In the rigorous architecture of a closing argument, numerical repetition does not function as rhetorical filler. It functions as an inescapable structural weight. He read the aggregate ledger into the federal record, a $29.9 million discrepancy in personal disclosure filings, 17 distinct line item contradictions, $287,000 mysteriously generated from a corporate entity formally documented as closed. A commercial winery assigned a $5 million valuation while possessing exactly $650 in liquid capital. Sworn photographic evidence of someone else's physical vineyard, 6 separate appearances within the evidentiary exhibits of a $250 million federal nutrition fraud ring, documented state campaign finance violations, and $41,200 in entirely undocumented outreach payments. When combined and recited in sequence, the list completely ceased to sound like a series of isolated, manageable political controversies. It sounded exactly like a forensic ledger detailing the systematic treatment of public trust as a private financial conduit. Then, Senator Kennedy delivered the singular question that made every preceding page point toward one inevitable conclusion. He did not request a partisan statement, he did not demand a moral lecture, and he did not launch another regional counterattack. He simply asked the exact same question that a defrauded investor inherently possesses the right to ask regarding his missing $300,000. It was the exact same question the Minnesota Fraud Prevention Committee had formally attempted to ask. It was the exact same question that tax-paying families deserve to ask when federal emergency relief vanished into fictitious empty storefronts. He looked directly at Representative Omar and asked, "Where did the money go?" The inquiry was structurally brutal and almost mathematically impossible to answer without actively opening every single legal door she had spent the entire morning desperately attempting to keep sealed. The silence that immediately followed that question did not feel acoustically empty. It felt overwhelmingly dense, filled instantly with every single integer Kennedy had systematically dragged into the chamber and every single substantive answer Representative Omar had failed to provide. 5 seconds of absolute silence passed, then 10 seconds, then 15 seconds. The massive architectural space of the hearing room appeared to physically shrink around her active microphone. Representative Omar's mouth visibly opened and her lips moved. For a microscopic fraction of a second, it appeared a word might physically materialize, perhaps the initial brick of a rhetorical wall that her communications staff could later synthesize into a defense. But the sound never arrived. Where did the money go is not an inquiry engineered for political rhetoric. It is an inquiry engineered for financial records. And financial records, unlike political audiences, do not applaud when a politician attempts to dodge them. Kennedy remained seated, observing the silence construct itself. He did not display a victory grin. He did not require theatrical triumph, because the silence itself was already performing the necessary forensic work. In a federal hearing room, total silence transforms directly into empirical evidence within the minds of every individual watching. Then, Kennedy folded his reading glasses, placed them deliberately on the mahogany desk, and delivered the final clinical assessment. The audit was merely beginning, and this time she should rigorously check the math. The committee chairman immediately attempted to force the procedural machinery forward. Microphones clicked. Secondary witnesses approached the table. Aides shuffled documentation, and the formal sanitized language of federal oversight returned to the room a dynamic that resembled an individual attempting to absorb blood off a marble floor utilizing a paper napkin. But Representative Omar did not engage. She did not ask a single additional question for the remaining duration of the 2-hour hearing. A politician whose entire career architecture was constructed upon high-velocity speech, instant confrontation, and the ability to convert every procedural inquiry into a moral battlefield, sat completely paralyzed behind her nameplate. Her reference materials remained unopened. Her water glass remained untouched. Her legislative aide desperately passed her written notes throughout the remainder of the session. In the operational ecosystem of Washington, staff notes function as critical lifelines pushed toward a drowning member. She did not read a single one of them. The crisis had fundamentally surpassed the boundaries of political messaging. The numbers had physically become larger than the message. By late morning, the digital clip of the specific exchange had already escaped the physical boundaries of the committee room. Washington bureaucracy inherently moves slowly, but it accelerates to lightning velocity when a highly vocal politician completely freezes on a broadcast camera. By noon, the specific question, "Where did the money go?" had saturated every major digital platform. The velocity was not generated by a sudden public fascination with federal disclosure statutes, but because the footage possessed the ultimate catalyst, a brutally simple question resting on top of a massive mountain of ugly, verified details. By the afternoon, Representative Omar's office released a formal public statement. The document was highly revealing, functioning as a confession through omission. The statement aggressively categorized Kennedy's audit as a partisan ambush and attempted to drag the narrative back into the familiar, insulated swamp of ideological warfare. However, the text deliberately failed to address the 17 distinct disclosure discrepancies. It failed to explain the defunct E Street Group income. It did not touch the sworn investor affidavit or the fabricated winery valuation. It provided zero accounting for the $41,200 in undocumented outreach capital, and it maintained absolute, terrifying silence regarding the Charlie Kirk assassination. If Kennedy's mathematics were factually incorrect, the standard operational protocol would dictate an immediate itemized correction. Instead, the office provided the public with an ideological cloud, actively refusing to produce a single receipt. The institutional consequences materialized with absolute precision. The Minnesota Fraud Prevention Committee instantly renewed its request for her physical appearance, now carrying the explicit legal shadow of a federal subpoena. The House Oversight Committee announced that the Budget Committee's forensic analysis was being formally incorporated into an ongoing, expanded review. That evening, her campaign officially canceled a scheduled fundraising event, citing a generalized scheduling conflict, the standard terminology deployed when the schedule is absolutely not the primary conflict. Outside the hearing room, Senator Kennedy delivered the definitive summary of the entire operation. When pressed by the media regarding the accusations of a partisan ambush, he refused to enter the ideological cage. He stated with profound simplicity that numbers are inherently not partisan. The arithmetic equation of 2 plus 2 does not care whether an individual registers as a Republican or a Democrat. $650 remains exactly $650, regardless of political affiliation. And a defrauded investor who was shown fabricated photographs of a stranger's property is not seeking a campaign slogan. He is exclusively seeking the return of his $300,000. Kennedy had not buried Representative Omar under political ideology. He had systematically buried her under empirical documents that could be printed, mathematically counted, legally dated, verified, signed, and audited. That is the absolute savage lesson of the Budget Committee hearing. If a politician intends to attack a forensic auditor on the subject of arithmetic, they are structurally required to bring completely clean financial books. If a politician intends to lecture the nation regarding accountability, their own signed disclosures must survive a microscopic line-by-line review. In that cold, overlit room, Representative Ilhan Omar did not lose the engagement to volume, she did not lose to manufactured outrage, and she did not lose to partisan theater. She lost to math, and math did not blink.